In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to read data from an input file in C++. The file I will be working with is named items.csv. It's a comma-separated value file with 3 fields in it: a string, an integer, and a double. This is the file that I used in the video about how to read input files with embedded spaces. This program will read the 3 records from the file and save each of the fields in a separate vector. So I've begun my program by including iostream, fstream to work with files, string because one of the data items is a string, and vector so I can create a vector with each of the data types. I created an input file stream variable named input file, and then I created 4 variables to hold the values for the current record: an integer for quantity, a double for the price, and then a string named item. I have a 4th variable named temp, which is also a string, so that I can use getline to read the numeric data into it. Then I have 3 vectors, 1 for each of the data types: a vector of strings named names, a vector of ints named quantity, and a vector of double named prices. And then finally, so I can summarize the data, I have an integer to count the records and an integer to total up the quantities. The first thing that we'll need to do is open the file. So I'm going to use my variable name for my input file, follow it by a period because it's an object, and I'm going to call the open function. There are 9 different ways we can call the open function. I'm going to call it by passing a string with the name of the file. As soon as I open it, I want to test to see if it's successfully opened. So I'll say if not input file dot is open. That's a function that will return true or false. So if it isn't open, then I'm going to display an error message. And I'm not going to be able to continue this program because the rest of it depends on the file being open. So I'm going to return a non-zero code to suggest that there is an error. I'll return the value 1. Now to test the logic to detect if a file did not open, I'm going to change the name of my file to an invalid name, and I'm going to run the program and verify that the logic for showing that the file didn't open is working correctly before I continue. So I changed the name of the file by adding a 2, and I'm going to run it. And when I execute the program, I do get a message that says file open failure, and I can see that my program ended with a code of 1. So that appears to be working correctly. So I'm going to correct the name. I'm going to get rid of the 2 to use the correct name so I can continue on with the program. And I'm going to want to count the records, so I'll begin by initializing count to 0. And then I'm going to build a while loop to read each record in this file. Now I happen to know there are 3 records in the file, but I won't always know that, so I'm going to use a while loop. And I want to execute this file as long as we are not at the end of the file. So I'm going to ask the file stream object, are you at the end of the file, by calling the EOF function. If I am at the end of the file, this will return true, and then I will exit my while loop. So now let's read the records. I'm going to increment my count because I just read a record. And now I'm going to get the first field in the record. That's a string describing the item. So I'm going to use getline. And I want to get a line from input file. This is the same function that we can use with cn, but I'm working with input file as my source. I want to save that first field into my variable item, and I want to read up to and including a comma. So the comma is my delimiter. It marks where one field ends and another begins. So that will read the very first field item, which is a string. So I'm reading it into a string, and I'm finished with that one. Now let's read the next field. But this field is an integer, and I can't read it into an integer. I have to read it into a string. So I'm going to read it into my temp string, and this is also delimited with a comma. Now I can convert temp to an integer and save it in variable quantity. So quantity is equal to string to int temp. So this function will take the string temp, extract the number out of it, and convert it to an integer, return that, and assign it to quantity. Now I just have one more field to read on the record, and that's the price. Again, I have to read it as a string. I'm about to write price, which that's not going to work. And then this field is the last field in the record. And the default delimiter with getline is an end of line or return character, so I don't have to specify a delimiter here. I can just end this with a semicolon. And then just like I did with the quantity integer variable, I'm going to assign price to string to double of that string temp. So we just read the price into a string named temp, then I'm going to convert it to a double by calling std. Now I have all three fields from my current record, and I can process these fields however I wish. So let's save these fields in a vector. And that might be something I want to do. I may want to read data from a file and store it in some type of data structure. So I have three vectors, one for each field, and I'm just going to use pushback to add a field or add a value to each of the vectors. Currently these vectors are empty and don't have any elements, so I cannot use the @ function. Let's put a comment actually. Save values in vectors. All right, so I'm going to go one at a time each vector, names dot pushback, and then the parameter for pushback will be the value I want to add to the names vector, and that's going to be item. I'll do the same thing with the quantity vector. By passing qty to the vector or the pushback function. And then finally the prices vector. And I'm going to push back the current price. So now I've read all three fields, I converted the numbers to the correct data type, and I have saved the values in a vector. I'm also going to total the quantity of all the items. So I have a total variable up here at the top, It has not been initialized, so I can either initialize it when I create it, or I can initialize it like I did with count. So I'll do total the other way. I'll go ahead and initialize it to 0 where I declared it. So right now I have a total of 0. I'm going to add the current quantity to the total. And I'll use the combined operator plus equal. And that will add quantity to total. The last thing I'm going to do is echo the fields back on the console window. This is a great way to test when you're first working with a file. If I had 1,000 records, I wouldn't want to do this, but with working with a small file or doing my initial testing, this can be good. Make sure I really am getting these values out. Well, I'm going to first display item. I'm going to separate that with a space. I'm going to display quantity. And finally, a $sign and price. So if I correctly converted the quantity and the price variables, then I shouldn't have any problem displaying them with this cout. And there's one more thing that I need to do. I need to know if I just read the last record. Am I at the end of the file? I don't want to read another record because I want to save it. I don't want to change where I'm pointing in my buffer so that I can read the next record. So instead of reading it, I'm going to use peek. And the peek function is just going to look past my current area in my file to see if the next character is the end of the file, or if I do still have characters to read. So if I am at the end of the file, peek will set the EOF bit flag, and when I go back up to the top of my while loop, issue my test condition, I'll see that I am at the end of the file and I won't try to execute the while loop body again. All right, so we're getting close to being finished here. Let's put a comment in front of this one. All right, so we're checking if we're at the end of the file. All right, after I get out of my while loop, I'm going to display some information. I want to display how many records I read. And I want to display the total quantity. All right, so that's what I'll display at the end. Additionally, once I finish working with my file, I need to close the file. So as soon as I get out of the while loop, that's a good place to put my close function. And close doesn't have any parameters. We just issue it like that. And now I'll say that I will print summary data. All right, so now I'm going to test the program and see if this works. I've done a lot of things here, and it hasn't been possible to test each item as I go because they all kind of work together. So normally I don't like to code this much before I test, but let's start without debugging. And I see that there are the 3 records that I have. I'm going to compare them to what I have in the file. I read Dr. Pepper on a 5 and 129, Coca-Cola 7, 129, Cheetos 10, 179. That all looks correct. The count says that I read 3 records, which is correct, and that the total quantity is 22. So if I add the 5 and the 7 and the 10, that will total 22. So it looks like the total is correct as well. So let's summarize what we did here. I'm going to close this window, these extra windows here. I first opened the file and checked to make sure that the file successfully opened. Then I initialized count to 0 and I began the while loop where I read one record at a time, one for each iteration of the while loop. In the while loop, I incremented my count. Then I used getline to read the 3 fields in the file. The first one was a string, the second was an integer, the third was a double. So I had to convert the integer and the double. And then after I did that, I saved the values in vectors. Finally, I I added quantity to total, displayed the fields, and then I used peek to check if I was at the end of the file. After I exited the while loop, I closed the file and then print the summary data as far as the number of records read and the total value for the total quantity. So whenever we're reading data where we have spaces embedded in our file, we need to use getline. If this had just been a file of numbers and I didn't have spaces, I could have just read it the same way that you read with CN. It's a lot simpler, but doesn't work with string data that has spaces.